Hey everyone, and welcome to the second section of this course where we're going to be discussing polarization, and we're going to be taking an institutional perspective on what's led to polarization. And by that I mean, rather than focusing on aspects of like individual psychology or particular historical events, we're going to look at the way in which our institutions are set up and the role that's played in polarization. So Drutman is the author of the book we're reading, and I think there's a very clear thesis here in which he writes, political parties are the central institutions of democracy. They clarify and structure alternatives, they make politics accessible to the masses, and they channel and organize political ambition. The only form of modern mass democracy that has worked is party democracy. We need strong, healthy parties for democracy to work well. We just need more than two. And so right off the bat, I think this is really useful in terms of talking about how important political parties are. I think if you listen to popular rhetoric, there's often a condemnation of political parties, which certainly are flawed. But as Drutman points out, there has not been any other workable system that doesn't channel democratic desires through the apparatus of some sort of political party in order to transform them into concrete public policy. So let's start with, he has this idea of we're in a two-party doom loop. So a doom loop is sort of anything that's a reinforcing cycle that's hard to break. So being in debt is one example where you might take on new bad debt to pay off an old debt, etc. Or generally just being in poverty can be its own cycle where it's very difficult to break out of that. And just in general, toxic rivalries where one group does something and so another group escalates and then the first group escalates again and then you get this repeated cycle of escalations. That's quite bad. The other thing I'm going to say up front is, we are going to learn from history here, and we are going to be discussing like how the US is set up. I will admit up front that one of my pet peeves is whenever someone says the founders thought X or Y, because the founders were a fairly large group of people that didn't agree with each other. Like there might be some statements such that you could say like almost all the founders believed X was true. Like all of them were suspicious of centralized power, but also didn't want something so decentralized that it led to the failures of the Articles of Confederation, right? But that's a very broad statement, right? Like we're just saying they wanted to wind up somewhere between monarchy and full decentralized state Articles of Confederation type stuff, right? They were all debating the entire spectrum of like how to set this up, and most of what got written down is a compromise. I also think they generally did a very good job with the information available to them at the time. I mean, one advantage we have is we've seen, 250 additional years of history, both in this country and in others. So I don't think it's absurd to talk about like problems that are inherent in the way things are set up. We're not like trying to say, oh, we're smarter than the founders or wiser. We're trying to say, oh, well, we've learned a few things since then in 250 years. And we also have a lot of very smart people today who think about this stuff very deeply and can suggest like these are ways in which institutions work. And I think the biggest single miss we have is that the founders were not really thinking about the roles political parties would wind up playing. And then political parties arose right away, because the system simply doesn't work without them. And so they weren't thinking about like, should we have 2 or 5? They were thinking we should have none. But again, this system with none just doesn't work. So somewhat perhaps interestingly from today's perspective, 70 years ago, there was a concern that there was too little partisanship. The American Political Science Association said, the parties are so similar, we can't tell the difference. The public is just, confused. We need parties that are different so people can tell. I also really like this quote from Ezra Klein. I used to assign a book of his, Why We're Polarized, before I started assigning this book by Drutman. And he writes that the act of choosing a party is the act of choosing whom we trust to transform our values into precise policy judgments. Right? So like this just gets back at this necessity of we need a party because in general we have values and we have thoughts about how society should be functioning. But most of us are not policy scholars. Admittedly, that's not as true of the group that's like listening to this because you're all in a policy program. But in general, people are not policy scholars, right? And so like as this has happened, we wind up, polarization has happened, we wind up with an increasing number of voters identifying as independent, but really just being against one party rather than like for the party they're voting. So we wind up with a lot of really negative affect around the parties where people don't like the party they vote for necessarily, but they definitely dislike the party they don't vote for. And so just to drive home this sort of idea of, rhetorical shifts, 2 quotes from presidents. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here, even though sometime back they may have entered illegally. And the era of big government is over. Pause a moment so you can guess who said those. Top one is Reagan. The bottom one is Clinton. I think if you're familiar with the current positions of the Democratic and Republican parties, you would probably associate these statements with opposite partisanship there. But I want to back up from that more immediate example and talk a little bit about history and partisan sorting and what happened. So there was essentially a Southern Democratic Party that we frequently is abbreviated as Dixiecrats, and they were kind of their own institution. They had one-party rule in the South. They controlled like 95% of elected offices in the South, so it was all Democrats of the sort we would call Dixiecrats. And this was very much, pretty much an openly white supremacist or racist party that was pro-segregation, pro-one-party rule, very opposed to any advancements for African Americans, and of course opposed the Civil Rights Act. When the Civil Rights Act passed, it passed under a Democratic president, Johnson, but it largely passed on Republican votes because Northern Republicans at the time were racially liberal relative to the time period. However, because of the flashpoint of presidential campaigns and because Republicans nominated someone in Barry Goldwater who was opposed to the Civil Rights Act, we wound up with a sort of polarization around the Civil Rights Act where Democrats were coded as pro-Civil Rights Act, Republicans against. And then over time, over the next 50-ish years, the parties sorted on ideology. And so Southern conservatives who had been Dixiecrats became Republicans, and Northern liberals who had been Republicans became Democrats. And then at the same time, we also sorted on everything else. So race, religion, geography, and more than north-south or particular states, this geographic division is urban and rural, with urban cities voting for Democrats and rural areas voting for Republicans. Now, I want to also clarify that, while there's been a bunch of sorting, it's a very large country. There's a large absolute number of people in urban areas who are Republican and in rural areas who are Democrat. You should not think that just because someone is urban or rural, they are going to be Democrat or Republican. But we did see this sorting relative to before, when things like religion and geography would not necessarily have told you too much about someone's political preferences in terms of if you had to make a pure prediction, which again, I recommend against doing. Just, ask people, and if they're willing to talk about it, they will tell you. So, but this overlapping sorting leads to additional information bubbles that wouldn't exist without sorting if it was only each, right? If I was going to some sort of church where the congregation was split 50-50, that means I'd be talking to people of different political persuasions, right? And if I lived in a neighborhood and then spoke to my neighbors about politics, they wouldn't all have the same political beliefs as I do, right? There's also probably some psychological underpinnings to this sorting as well, just as there are to people for different reasons choose different geographies to live in, etc. So one of the other things I want to point out here is that pretty much all politics has some aspect of being identity politics. Because politics is driven by, a means of expressing our belonging to groups, and this is a form of identifying ourselves. So Liliana Mason suggests, as I was talking about earlier, that the crisis that we're having is when our partisan identities fall into alignment with all of our other social identities, stoking our intolerance of each other to levels that are unsupported by our degrees of political disagreement, right? So now we're really far from the other people, from the people whose party we don't identify with, along a large number of dimensions, making it much harder to actually talk and sympathize. And again, I'm not saying this doesn't happen. Like, I want to be clear, many people still, in fact, do talk about politics and have good discussions about politics. But as a whole, we have seen increasing polarization and increasing unwillingness to even discuss politics, often for good reason, right? Like, if every time you discuss politics it ends in a shouting match, like, that's not productive, and there's no reason to continue to do that, at least not in the same way that it has been happening, right? And so I think one final source of conflict and confusion to highlight here that I think is interesting is that each party right now has some of what it appears the other wants, and maybe this is just a case of always wanting what you don't have. But the right does, in general, have large amounts of political power, at least over the past few years on the same level, and particularly because of the way the Electoral College works, it has political power that is slightly in excess of its actual popularity. The left, however, has a lot of cultural and economic power. The geographic bases that are voted for by Democrats are stronger in terms of GDP, stronger in terms of, just general economic status. And then, of course, like, culturally and artistically, the majority of people producing mass American culture are, in fact, generally in sympathy with, like, democratic policies and priorities. Now, often, sometimes that's explicit, sometimes it's not, but it is the case right now that, like, generally speaking, cultural and economic power tend towards the left of the political spectrum, while political power has tended towards the right to some degree, or else been relatively balanced over the past decade or so. Okay, that's all I want to talk about. As usual, look forward to the discussion this week.